1,000 years of British history can fit, uneasily, into 10 names. Not the greatest kings, not the finest minds, not the victors polished by monuments. 10 faces remembered for another reason, for betrayal, for cruelty, for fear, for the kind of damage that survives long after the body is gone. Some wore crowns, some wore robes, some hid behind politics, religion, or a respectable public voice. One left no confirmed face at all, and together, they ask a colder question than simple villainy ever could. How does a person become remembered not for what they built, but for what they broke? Slowly, the list begins to feel less like a ranking and more like a gallery where each portrait opens onto a different age of Britain, a kingdom under invasion, a court poisoned by ambition, a church afraid of dissent, a city terrified by an unknown killer, a modern nation tempted by extremism dressed in polished manners. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because this story is not really about deciding, with perfect confidence, who was the single worst Briton who ever lived. History rarely gives us that kind of clean verdict. Reputations are built from evidence, rumor, propaganda, memory, and sometimes the needs of later generations who wanted a monster simple enough to understand. But the names on this list endure because they reveal something larger than themselves. Eadric Streona shows us betrayal in a collapsing kingdom. King John shows us power so misused that even medieval England began searching for limits. Titus Oates shows how a lie can become a public fever. Oswald Mosley shows how hatred can arrive not as chaos, but as style, rhetoric, and organization. So we begin here. Not with a courtroom, but with a question. When history curses a name, is it judging one person alone, or the world that allowed them to do harm? The list itself has a peculiar origin. It was not carved into a courthouse wall, and it was not passed down from some ancient council of moral certainty. It came from historians being asked to nominate 10 of the worst Britons in history, a deliberately provocative exercise, the sort that invites argument almost as much as it invites judgment. And that matters, because a list like this can pretend to be simple. It offers the comfort of names, as if history's darkest impulses can be gathered neatly into 10 human containers. Here are the traitors. Here are the tyrants. Here are the liars, persecutors, opportunists, murderers, and men who discovered that fear could be useful. But no serious look at the past should leave the matter there. To call someone the worst is not the same as understanding why they were dangerous. It may even get in the way. A bad reputation can become a mask, and behind that mask there is usually something more unsettling than individual wickedness. A society under strain, an institution hungry for control, a crowd ready to believe the convenient lie, a ruler willing to reward the person who does the ugliest work. That is why the list was never innocent. Not because the historians who helped shape it were somehow wrong to judge. Judgment has its place. Some actions leave trails of suffering too clear to be politely blurred. But a ranking of villains can easily become a game, and the past does not become more truthful when it is turned into a tournament of monsters. The more useful question is different. What kind of damage did each person make possible? Some caused harm by turning loyalty into a weapon. Some did it through law, office, accusation, or sermon. Some built careers on the weak points of their age: religious panic, dynastic fear, anti-Catholic hysteria, hatred of immigrants, resentment of outsiders, terror of women who lived beyond the protection of polite society. And some are difficult, because their reputations are not made of one material. Thomas Becket, for instance, cannot simply be flattened into a villain without doing violence to the evidence. To many, he was a martyr, murdered in a cathedral because he would not bend the church to royal power. To others, especially in the context of this list, he appears as a man whose rigidity and ambition helped ignite a conflict that others paid for in blood. The truth is not served by pretending the choice is easy. That is the first rule of this investigation. The names are entries, not verdicts. Each one opens a door. Behind Eadric Streona is an England close to collapse, where betrayal could feel like political instinct. Behind King John is the old problem of a ruler who treats a kingdom as a possession rather than a trust. Behind Hugh Despenser is a court where royal favor becomes a private weapon. Behind Thomas Arundel is the fear that ordinary people might read, think, and believe without permission. And then the doors lead onward, into Tudor trials, Restoration paranoia, the smoke after Culloden, the gaslit anxiety of Whitechapel, and finally the polished menace of 20th century fascism. Seen this way, the list becomes less like a row of portraits and more like a map of British anxieties. It tells us what different ages feared most: treason, tyranny, heresy, false witness, disorder, violence from below, violence from above, the stranger in the street, the demagogue in the hall. It also tells us something uncomfortable about memory. History does not remember harm evenly. Some victims are named in chronicles and legal records. Others survive only as categories: the dispossessed, the accused, the poor, the defeated, the frightened. Some perpetrators became infamous because their enemies wrote well. Others escaped full judgment because power protected them, or because the people they harmed were not considered important enough to preserve. So as we move through these 10 lives, the question will keep changing shape. It will not always be, was this person evil? Sometimes it will be, who benefited from calling him evil? Sometimes, who was left out of the story? And sometimes, more quietly, how many people had to cooperate before one person could become dangerous? That is where the gallery begins to darken. Not with the worst man already chosen, but with the world that made such men useful. In the early 11th century, England was not a settled nation looking back on its own glory. It was a kingdom under pressure, its borders shaken by Danish armies, its politics thinned by suspicion, and its ruling class forced to make choices in a world where defeat was not an abstract possibility. It was arriving by ship. This is the world in which Eadric Streona becomes infamous. His name has not survived because of a great reform, a noble speech, or a heroic last stand. It survives because later memory made him almost the perfect image of the traitor. The man who changes sides at the moment, loyalty becomes expensive. And yet, to understand why his reputation became so poisonous, we have to resist the temptation to treat him as a cartoon. Treachery in a collapsing kingdom, in a tale, rarely announces itself with a black cloak and a wicked smile. It can look like caution. It can look like realism. It can even look for a time like clever survival. Eadric rose during the troubled reign of Ethelred, the king remembered by the famous and slightly unfair nickname, the Unready. England faced repeated attacks from Scandinavian forces, and the political atmosphere was one of exhaustion. Armies were raised, tribute was paid, alliances shifted. Trust became difficult to distinguish from calculation. Eadric's power came from proximity to the throne. He was an ealdorman, a great nobleman, and he married into the royal family. That placed him near the nervous center of English politics, where the personal and the political were never safely separated. A marriage alliance could be a promotion. A whisper could become a death sentence. A change of loyalty could save a man's life, or mark him forever. The accusations against Eadric are severe. Later accounts associate him with murder, manipulation, and repeated betrayal. He is said to have arranged the killing of rivals, to have abandoned the English cause at crucial moments, and to have shifted allegiance when the balance of power moved from Ethelred's line toward the Danish conqueror Canute. The difficulty, as always with this period, is that the sources are not neutral windows. They are written by people who had their own loyalties, their own wounds, and their own need to explain disaster. When a kingdom falls, someone must carry the blame. A traitor is useful because he gives defeat a human face. But Eadric's reputation did not grow from nothing. Again and again, his name appears near the fracture points of Anglo-Saxon England. When loyalty was needed, he seems to have been suspected of hesitation. When unity was fragile, he seems to have deepened division. And in the brutal politics of conquest, that kind of man can thrive for a little while, not forever, just long enough to become hated. There is something especially disturbing about a figure like Eadric, because he represents a form of harm that does not require supreme command. He was not a king. He did not invent the Danish invasions. He did not single-handedly bring down Anglo-Saxon England. History is rarely that tidy. His danger lay in his usefulness. A weak kingdom can survive an enemy outside its walls more easily than it can survive powerful men inside those walls who are always calculating the advantage of being on the winning side. Eadric appears in memory as the man who understood that collapse creates opportunities. If one ruler fails, serve the next. If one oath becomes inconvenient, reinterpret it. If the old order is dying, make sure you are not buried with it. That is not merely cowardice. It is a political instinct turned predatory. Eventually, Eadric attached himself to Canute, the Danish king who emerged as ruler of England. For a brief moment, survival seemed to have worked. The man accused of betraying one side had found a place near the victor. But victors have their own logic. A conqueror may reward betrayal, but he rarely trusts the traitor. A man who has sold one master has already advertised his price. According to later accounts, Canute had Eadric killed after his usefulness had ended. The details vary in the telling, and some of the more theatrical versions should be treated carefully. Medieval chroniclers had a taste for moral symmetry. They liked a villain to receive a fitting end. Still, the outline is telling enough. Eadric survived the fall of one world, only to discover that survival was not the same as security. He had made himself valuable in a time of crisis, but not honorable. Necessary, perhaps, for a moment. Respected, no. That may be why his name endured so bitterly, because betrayal offends memory in a particular way. Cruel kings can be feared. Fanatics can be explained by belief. Murderers can be placed outside the circle of ordinary society. But the traitor is more intimate. He stands close before he turns. He knows the language of loyalty well enough to counterfeit it. And in the story of Anglo-Saxon England's fall, Eadric Streona became the man people could point to when the larger tragedy felt too vast to hold. A kingdom was weakened by invasion, poor leadership, military strain, factional rivalry, and the hard realities of Northern European power. But one name carried the smell of the betrayal. Eadric did not destroy England alone. That is the easy myth. What he represents is more unsettling. The way a society under pressure can become vulnerable to men whose only permanent loyalty is to their own survival. Men who do not need to win battles to change history. They only need to be standing near the door when the old order begins to burn. The murder of Thomas Becket is one of those scenes in English history that feels almost too vivid to belong to the 12th century. A winter evening. Canterbury Cathedral. The Archbishop near the altar. 4 knights arriving with the anger of a king still ringing in their ears. then violence in a place built to separate earth from heaven. For centuries, that image has been difficult to escape. Becket became the murdered saint, the defender of the church, the man whose blood turned a political quarrel into a pilgrimage. His shrine drew kings, peasants, penitents, and travelers. His death became a kind of sacred accusation, and yet his presence on a list of the worst Britons asks us to look at the story from a more uncomfortable angle, not to deny the brutality of his murder. That part should not be softened. A man was killed in a cathedral by armed knights who believed or chose to believe that royal anger had given them permission. But Becket's life before that moment is more complicated than the glow of martyrdom allows. He was not born into sainthood. He was a political creature long before he became an ecclesiastical symbol. As Chancellor to Henry II, he had been close to the machinery of royal power. He understood the court. He enjoyed status. He moved in the world of privilege, diplomacy, pressure, and favor. Henry trusted him enough to raise him higher than most men could dream of climbing. Then came the appointment that changed everything. Henry made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury, likely expecting that his friend and former chancellor would help bring the English Church more firmly into line with royal authority. It was a reasonable expectation, at least from the king's point of view. Medieval kings did not appoint major churchmen merely because they admired their souls. They wanted allies in robes, but Becket did not behave like the ally Henry expected. Once he became archbishop, he seemed to step into the role with a severity that startled those around him. The man of the court became the man of the church. Whether this was sincere transformation, political theater, spiritual awakening, or some mixture of all three remains one of the difficult questions around him. Human beings do not always change for one clean reason. What followed was not simply a personality clash. It was a struggle over jurisdiction, authority, and the border between two powerful systems that both claimed moral legitimacy. The central issue was not whether king or church mattered more in some abstract sense. It was practical and immediate. Who had the right to discipline clergy accused of crimes? Could churchmen be tried in royal courts? How far could Henry's law reach into the privileged space of ecclesiastical authority? To modern ears, Becket can sound like a defender of institutional immunity. To many in his own religious world, he looked like a guardian of sacred liberty against royal overreach. Both impressions contain part of the truth, and neither fully rescues him from scrutiny. This is why Becket is such a dangerous figure to judge quickly. If we see him only through the king's frustration, he becomes rigid, obstructive, vain, and unwilling to compromise, even when compromise might have spared England years of bitterness. If we see him only through the cult of martyrdom, he becomes pure resistance, a holy man murdered because power could not tolerate conscience. The real man stands somewhere more difficult. There are accusations, especially in hostile interpretations, that Becket was ambitious, theatrical, and personally motivated. Those claims should be handled with care. Ambition is easy to diagnose across 8 centuries, and theater is not always insincerity. Medieval politics was performed in public gestures, ceremonial refusals, symbolic clothing, visible humiliation, and dramatic acts of defiance. A man could be genuine and theatrical at the same time. Still, Becket's rigidity mattered. A conflict between king and archbishop was not a private disagreement between two proud men in expensive clothing. Their quarrel pulled others into danger. It strained the relationship between crown and church. It forced bishops, nobles, clerks, and ordinary believers to navigate competing loyalties. It made every legal question feel like a test of obedience. And Henry II was not a minor opponent. He was one of the most formidable rulers of medieval Europe. Restless, intelligent, administrative, impatient. He wanted order, He wanted law. He wanted the royal system to function with fewer exceptions. In many ways, that impulse helped shape English government. But order can become domination when it refuses limits. Becket, whatever else he was, became the limit Henry could not easily absorb. This is where the tragedy sharpens. The conflict did not require sainthood on one side and villainy on the other. It required two powerful men, each convinced that the larger principle depended on his refusal to bend. Henry believed royal justice was being obstructed. Becket believed ecclesiastical liberty was being threatened. Neither position was absurd. Both could become destructive. That is often how history becomes deadly. Not because everyone involved is pretending, but because the sincere belief of powerful men can make compromise feel like betrayal. By the time the knights entered Canterbury, Becket had already become more than a person. To Henry's supporters, he was a problem that would not disappear. To his defenders, he was the church standing upright against the crown. To Becket himself, perhaps, he had become inseparable from the office he held. When a man begins to embody a cause, he may gain courage. He may also lose the ability to step aside. His murder transformed the argument instantly. A difficult archbishop became a martyr. A royal outburst, however indirectly intended, became stained with sacrilege. Henry was forced into public penance. Canterbury became one of the great pilgrimage sites of medieval Europe. The dead man gained more power in memory than he had ever held in life. And this is why Becket's place among the condemned is so revealing. He is not here because he was a butcher, a liar like Titus Oates, or a political extremist like Mosley. He is here because some historians and critics have seen in him another kind of danger, the man whose uncompromising posture helped turn a negotiable conflict into a sacred crisis. But even that judgment must remain uneasy. Calling Becket one of the worst Britons says as much about the values of the judge as it does about the man. If you fear religious privilege above all, Becket may look like the champion of an institution resisting lawful accountability. If you fear state power above all, he may look like the necessary barrier against a king who wanted every authority beneath his hand. The same life can warn in two directions. That is what makes him so different from Eadric Streona. Eadric's memory reeks of self-preservation. Becket's memory burns with principle, ego, courage, obstinacy, and performance tangled so tightly that separating them may be impossible. Perhaps the most honest thing to say is this: Thomas Becket did not simply light the fire, and he did not simply die in it. He became one of the figures through whom medieval England argued about power itself. Who may judge whom? Where does loyalty end? When does conscience become pride? And when a man is killed for refusing to yield, does death purify the whole story, or merely make it harder to question? Canterbury gave England a saint. It also left behind a warning about what happens when institutions speak through men who cannot afford to be seen blinking first. There are kings who fail because the world turns against them. And then there is King John, who often seems to have helped the world along. His reputation has never fully recovered, not because one story ruined him, but because so many different stories agreed on the same general shape: suspicion, pettiness, cruelty, political failure, and a talent for making enemies faster than he could defeat them. He became the king people reached for when they needed an example of bad rule, the villain in later legend, the grasping monarch in the background of Robin Hood, the man whose reign helped force England to ask a question no medieval king wanted asked too loudly. What if royal power needed limits? John was not born to be the central figure of English history. He was the youngest son of Henry II, the last in a line of powerful brothers, and for much of his early life he existed in the shadow of men who seemed larger, richer, and more obviously destined for command. His father's empire stretched across England and large parts of France, His brother Richard became the crusading warrior king, absent for much of his reign, but wrapped in the kind of heroic glamour that memory tends to forgive. John inherited the crown in 1199. He did not inherit the glamour. What he inherited was a complicated political machine. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and a network of nobles who held lands on both sides of the Channel, spoke the language of loyalty when useful, and understood very well that kings could be negotiated with, resisted, or abandoned. A medieval king was powerful, but he was not a modern state. He needed cooperation. He needed confidence. He needed men with armed followers to believe that his rule was worth supporting. John's great failure was not simply that he lost battles or territory. It was that people stopped trusting him. The shadow that hangs over his reign begins early, with the question of Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was John's nephew, the son of John's older brother Geoffrey, and therefore a rival claimant in the eyes of many. In a cleaner dynastic world, the succession might have been settled without the smell of danger, but medieval succession was often less like a legal process and more like a family argument conducted with castles. Arthur was captured in 1202. After that, his fate becomes one of the dark absences in John's story. The details remain uncertain. Later accounts placed suspicion directly on John, and some versions became vivid, even theatrical, in describing Arthur's end. We should be careful with those details. The evidence is not clean enough to recite the most dramatic accusations as proven fact. What we can say with more confidence is that Arthur disappeared while in John's custody, and that the disappearance was politically disastrous. In medieval politics, the appearance of guilt could do almost as much damage as guilt itself. A rival prince was alive, then captured, then gone. For John's enemies, that was enough. The story hardened into suspicion, and suspicion became a part of the atmosphere of his reign. A king can survive being feared. Many did. It is harder to survive being feared and distrusted at the same time. John's continental position soon began to collapse. The King of France, Philip II, pressed against him with patience and skill. Normandy, the great duchy tied so deeply to the English crown since the conquest, was lost in 1204. This was not a small embarrassment. It was a rupture in the identity of the ruling elite. For generations, the English kings had not been only English. They were cross-channel rulers with power, memory, and inheritance rooted in French lands. When Normandy fell away, John did not merely lose territory, he lost credibility. The loss exposed the fragility of his authority. Nobles who had lands and loyalties across the Channel had to make hard choices. The royal image suffered. And John, rather than soothing the political body, often seemed to press harder on the bruise. His government was energetic. That should be admitted. John was not lazy, and he was not stupid. He paid attention to administration, money, justice, and the machinery of rule. In another king, those qualities might have looked like discipline. In John, they often felt like pressure. He demanded revenue. He exploited feudal rights. He imposed heavy financial burdens. He used the legal and administrative system not merely as a tool of order, but as a means of extracting obedience. The problem was not only that he needed money. Medieval kings always needed money, and war was never cheap. The problem was that his methods deepened the belief that royal power had become predatory. There is a particular kind of ruler who makes efficiency feel like a threat. John was that kind. He could be attentive in the worst possible way. He noticed who owed what. He remembered grievances. He punished resistance. He seemed to treat the nobility not as partners in rule, however difficult, but as people to be squeezed, watched, and humbled. Even his strengths fed the distrust. A careless king might ruin you by accident. John gave the impression that he might ruin you on purpose. Then came his conflict with the church. The dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury drew John into a confrontation with Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes of the Middle Ages. England was placed under interdict. For ordinary people, that meant a spiritual crisis imposed from above. The normal public life of the church disrupted because king and pope were locked in battle. This was not an abstract constitutional disagreement. In a deeply religious society, the interruption of sacred routine carried emotional force. John eventually submitted to the pope and made England a papal fief, a move that can be read in more than one way. It was humiliating, certainly, but also politically practical. By yielding to the Pope, John gained a powerful ally against rebellious barons. As ever, he was capable of calculation. The trouble was that calculation could look very much like cynicism. By 1214, after the failed campaign that ended with defeat for his allies at Bouvines, John's hopes of recovering his lost continental lands were badly damaged. The military failure fed domestic anger. Years of taxation, distrust, disputed justice, and personal resentment came together. The barons were not modern democrats, and Magna Carta was not born as a declaration of universal liberty. That is a comfortable later myth. But even myths grow from something. In 1215, at Runnymede, John was forced to accept Magna Carta. The irony is almost too neat, but it is real enough to matter. One of England's most disliked kings helped produce one of the most famous symbols of limited government. Not because he believed in restraint, but because his abuses made restraint necessary to those powerful enough to demand it. Magna Carta did not instantly create constitutional freedom. It was annulled, revised, reissued, fought over, and reinterpreted. Its original concerns were often narrow, feudal, and elite, but the deeper principle proved difficult to bury. The king was not entirely above law. Even power at the top could be named, written down, and resisted. John did not intend to give England that lesson. He became the lesson. This is where his story differs from Becket's. Becket's danger, if we accept that darker reading, lay in the way principle could become immovable. John's lay in the opposite direction: power without moral steadiness, intelligence without trust, authority without enough restraint to preserve consent. He was not the first harsh king, and he was not the last. Medieval rule could be violent, extractive, and personally vindictive long before John touched the crown. But his reign gathered those tendencies into a case study so vivid that later generations kept returning to it. A bad king is useful to history because he clarifies things. He shows what subjects will tolerate and what they eventually will not. He reveals the hidden dependencies of monarchy: money, loyalty, reputation, fear, law, habit, and the belief that obedience is still preferable to revolt. When enough of those threads fray, even a crowned man can find himself surrounded by parchment and armed men, being told that his will is not the only law in the kingdom. John's final months were chaotic, marked by civil war and foreign intervention. He died in 1216, leaving a child heir and a wounded realm behind him. Death spared him the full consequences of the storm he had made, though not the judgment that followed. And yet, to call him simply monstrous is too easy. The more revealing truth is that John was a capable man whose capabilities made him worse. He understood government well enough to exploit it. He understood fear well enough to use it. He understood loyalty poorly enough to squander it. That combination is dangerous in any century, because tyranny is not always born from madness or incompetence. Sometimes it comes from a ruler who knows exactly where the levers are and pulls them until the whole structure begins to crack. King John forced England to imagine limits on power, not as a gift, as a warning. By the time Hugh Despenser the Younger rose to power beside Edward II, England had already learned that a king's affection could be politically dangerous. Royal favor was never just personal. It carried land, access, offices, pardons, marriages, protection, and the quiet terror of knowing whose door could open directly into the king's ear. A favorite did not need a crown to reshape a kingdom. He only needed the crowned man to keep choosing him. Despenser was not the first favorite to provoke resentment, and he would not be the last. But his name became attached to a particular kind of courtly corruption, not the glamorous corruption of feasts and jewels, but the colder kind, where private appetite learns to speak the language of law. He came from an ambitious, noble family. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was already a figure of influence, and the younger Hugh moved in the world of aristocratic marriage, inheritance, and royal service. On paper, this was the ordinary machinery of medieval advancement. Families rose by attaching themselves to power. Sons married heiresses. Lands changed hands. Legal claims were pressed, defended, revived, and sharpened. But in Despenser's case, ambition seems to have become unusually aggressive. His marriage connected him to the vast inheritance of the de Clare family, especially in the Welsh Marches, that rough borderland where lordship often had a harder edge than it did in the calmer imagination of royal government. The Marches were a world of castles, local rivalries, disputed rights, and noble families used to exercising power with considerable independence. Into that environment, Despenser brought not merely the appetite to gain, but the king's protection. That combination made him dangerous. A greedy noble could be resisted. A greedy noble backed by the king became a different problem altogether. Despenser's enemies accused him of seizing lands, manipulating legal processes, intimidating rivals, and exploiting those who were vulnerable to royal pressure. Some of the details come through hostile voices, and hostility always needs to be weighed carefully. Men who lost property to Despenser had every reason to describe him in the worst possible terms. But the breadth of resentment tells its own story. This was not a minor court quarrel inflated by gossip. Despenser became the focus of a serious political crisis because too many powerful people believed that royal authority had been captured for private gain. He did not merely benefit from Edward's favor. He seemed to turn that favor into an instrument. The difference matters. A favorite who receives gifts may be resented. A favorite who uses the king to break his enemies becomes a threat to the whole political order. Nobles could tolerate inequality. Medieval society was built on it. What they could not easily tolerate was the sense that the rules of rank, inheritance, and arbitration no longer mattered once one man had the king's private confidence. This was the wound Despenser widened. Edward II's reign had already been troubled by the memory of Piers Gaveston, another royal favorite whose rise had enraged the nobility and ended violently. Gaveston's story had shown how personal intimacy at court could become a public crisis. One might expect Edward to have learned caution. He did not. With Despenser, the problem returned in a harsher and more administrative form. Gaveston had been accused of arrogance, mockery, and monopolizing royal affection. Despenser's reputation is darker because it is tied so strongly to acquisition and coercion. He was not remembered merely as the man the king loved too much. He was remembered as the man who made that love profitable. There is something almost modern in that danger. Not in the setting, of course. The world of Despenser is still medieval. Seals, charters, oaths, castles, wardships, confiscations, and councils thick with grievance. But the mechanism feels recognizable. Public authority is bent toward private interest. Legal forms remain in place, yet their spirit is hollowed out. The victim is told that everything has been done properly, even while everyone in the room understands who benefits. Power becomes most frightening when it keeps its paperwork in order. Dispenser's reach extended into the lives of widows and heiresses, people whose property could become a target precisely because their protection depended on the structures men like him could influence. In a society where land was wealth, identity, and survival, dispossession was not a bookkeeping matter. It could erase a family's future. It could turn lineage into dependency. It could make a person's rights feel conditional on the mood of someone far above them. This is where the story should slow down. Because when we talk about corruption at court, it is easy to picture only angry barons defending their privileges. And yes, many of Dispenser's opponents were hardly champions of the powerless. They were armed magnates protecting their own interests, lands, and status. Their outrage was not pure public virtue, but corruption often becomes visible first when it threatens the powerful. That does not mean the harm stops with them. A court distorted by favoritism affects everyone below it. Local disputes are tilted. Offices are awarded through influence. Fear travels downward. Men who hope for advancement imitate what the center rewards. Those without protection learn to stay quiet, sell cheaply, accept judgment, or disappear from the record. Dispenser's career reminds us that the abuse of power is rarely contained at the top. It leaks. The crisis around him grew until open resistance became unavoidable. In 1321, the Marcher lords and other opponents moved against the Dispensers, forcing their exile. For a moment, it seemed that the political body had expelled the poison. But Edward brought them back. That decision turned resentment into something more explosive. The king had been warned, pressured, confronted, and still he chose the favorites. He chose them not in innocence, but after the country had shown him the cost. From that point on, opposition to Dispenser could not be separated from opposition to Edward himself. A bad favorite can survive if the king can plausibly pretend not to understand. Edward had lost that luxury. The years that followed hardened the regime. Dispenser's enemies were defeated, punished, dispossessed, or driven into deeper hostility. The machinery of royal revenge worked with grim efficiency. Yet every act that strengthened Edward and Dispenser in the short term made their position more brittle. Fear can silence a country, but it does not necessarily persuade it. Then came Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. Their invasion in 1326 was not large in the beginning, but it met a kingdom where the king's authority had been badly drained by the hatred surrounding his favorite. Political collapse can look sudden, but often it has been prepared for years by private disgust. People do not always need to love the rebels. Sometimes it is enough that they are tired of the men already in power. Dispenser's fall was brutal, and later accounts of his execution are often described with a relish that tells us as much about the hatred he inspired as about the punishment itself. We do not need to dwell on the physical details. The essential point is clear. He died not as a misunderstood administrator, but as a symbol of everything many believed had gone rotten in Edward's reign. His body became the place where political anger wrote its final sentence. But symbols can simplify. Was Hugh Dispenser the Younger uniquely monstrous? Or was he unusually successful at a kind of predation that the aristocratic world already encouraged? That question matters. Medieval lordship rewarded appetite. Land hunger was not unusual. Legal aggression was not unusual. Violent pressure was not unusual. What made Dispenser stand out was the scale of his opportunity and the intimacy of his access to the king. He shows us a form of corrupted power different from John's. John abused authority from the throne itself. Dispenser abused authority by standing close enough to the throne that his own desires could borrow its voice. He represents the danger of the intermediary, the man who is not sovereign, but who can make sovereignty serve him. In some ways, that is even more unsettling. A king is at least visible. His crown announces the problem. But a favorite works through proximity, whispers, documents, influence, pressure applied where the public cannot quite see it. The official order remains intact. The king still reigns. Councils still meet. Seals are still pressed into wax. And yet, behind the forms, the question changes. Not what does the law say, but who has the king's favor? When that becomes the more important question, government begins to rot from the inside. Dispenser's story is not simply a warning about greed, though greed is everywhere in it. It is a warning about access, about what happens when a ruler confuses personal loyalty with public judgment, about the private chamber becoming stronger than the council, about the court turning into a weapon that one man can aim at his enemies. That is why his name survived with such bitterness. He did not conquer England. He did not found a movement. He did not leave behind a doctrine or a dynasty of ideas. His legacy is narrower, and in that narrowness, very precise. He showed how much damage could be done by a man who knew where power slept. By the time Thomas Arundel enters this story, the danger has changed its clothing. We are no longer in the world of a collapsing Anglo-Saxon kingdom, or a king losing territory, or a royal favorite turning access into wealth. The battlefield is less visible now. The weapon is not always a sword, a charter, or a confiscated estate. Sometimes it is a question asked in the wrong language. Sometimes it is a book. Arundel was Archbishop of Canterbury in an age when the English Church felt pressure from an unsettling, new current of religious criticism. The movement associated with John Wycliffe, and later called Lollardy, challenged parts of church authority, criticized clerical wealth, and pushed ideas that disturbed the established order. Among the most sensitive questions was whether Scripture should be available in English, and under whose supervision it could be read. To modern ears, this can sound almost absurdly fearful. A Bible in English hardly seems like a threat. It seems ordinary, even obvious. But that reaction belongs to a world shaped by later assumptions. Mass literacy, printed books, personal religion, and the idea that private reading is a right rather than a risk. In Arundel's world, reading was not innocent. Translation was power. Interpretation was power. Preaching was power. A text placed into more hands could loosen the grip of those who claimed the authority to explain it. The Church did not see itself as merely guarding privilege, though privilege was certainly involved. It saw itself as guarding truth, unity, salvation, and the spiritual safety of a society where error was not just mistaken opinion. Error could be heresy. Heresy could infect. Infection, in that imagination, had to be contained. That is the logic that makes Arundel so important. He represents a form of corrupted power that is convinced it is protecting people. This is often the most durable kind. The truly cynical tyrant may know he is lying. The profiteer may know he is stealing. But the persecutor who believes he is saving souls can sleep well after building the cage. He can call surveillance charity. He can call fear discipline. He can call silence peace. Arundel's reputation is tied especially to the tightening of controls over religious thought in England. Under his authority, measures were issued that restricted unauthorized preaching and placed severe limits on the translation and use of Scripture in English without approval. The exact reach and practical enforcement of these measures could vary, and we should not imagine a perfectly modern police state suddenly appearing in the 15th century. Medieval systems were uneven, local, personal, and often inconsistent, but the intention was clear enough. Religious speech was to be watched. Books were to be controlled. The line between permitted belief and dangerous error was to be guarded by authority. What makes this chapter of English history so cold is not simply that repression existed. Medieval Europe knew many forms of religious coercion. The colder thing is the atmosphere it encouraged. Suspicion moving through parishes, universities, households, and pulpits. A sermon might not merely be a sermon. A manuscript might not merely be a manuscript. A neighbor's belief might become evidence. A private conversation could begin to feel less private. That is how surveillance enters the soul of a society. Not all at once. Not with one dramatic command that everyone instantly understands as darkness. It enters by persuading people that danger is everywhere, and that only obedience can keep them safe. Arundel did not invent fear of heresy. He inherited it, shaped it, and gave it institutional force in England at a crucial moment. The Church and the Crown increasingly found common cause in suppressing religious dissent. Because dissent was not only a theological problem, it could be read as social disorder. It could imply that ordinary people might judge their priests, challenge authority, gather around unauthorized teachers, and imagine a relationship with sacred truth not fully mediated by the hierarchy. In that world, a translated Bible was not just a book. It was a breach in the wall. This does not mean every English reader was a rebel, or every churchman a villain. That would be too easy and too false. Many clergy sincerely believed that unsupervised interpretation could mislead people. Some feared that bad teaching would spread faster than correction. Others were defending institutions that gave their lives meaning. Historical actors rarely walk around knowing they are the warning example in someone else's documentary. Still, sincerity does not erase harm. Arundel's measures helped create a climate in which religious curiosity could become dangerous, and in which control over language became control over conscience. The issue was not merely whether a text could be translated. It was who had permission to approach meaning itself. That question reaches beyond medieval theology. Every system of power has its forbidden translations. The thing that must not be put into common speech. The document that must remain in expert hands. The doctrine that must not be simplified, questioned, or carried into kitchens, workshops, fields, and marketplaces. When authority says, "This is too dangerous for ordinary people to understand," it may sometimes be acting from real concern. It may also be protecting itself from being understood too well. Arundel stands at that uneasy crossing. He was not a battlefield butcher. He did not rule through the obvious drama of royal cruelty. His power worked through permission and prohibition, through the shaping of what could be said aloud. In a list crowded with betrayal, greed, murder, and political extremism, his presence reminds us that history's damage is not always loud. Sometimes it is administrative, a license denied, a sermon forbidden, a manuscript condemned, a mind trained to pause before asking its own question. The fear of heresy also produced a particular moral danger. Once error is imagined as contamination, the person accused of error becomes easier to mistreat. You are not silencing a neighbor. You are stopping disease. You are not narrowing the human spirit. You are defending eternity. That language can make cruelty feel hygienic. And that is why religious repression can be so difficult to challenge from inside its own age. It presents itself not as violence, but as care. Not as domination, but as guardianship. There were, of course, real tensions in late medieval England. Religious dissent could overlap with social unrest, political suspicion, and memories of rebellion. Authorities did not act in a vacuum. They acted in a world where order felt fragile and where unity was prized because division could become deadly. But this is exactly the point. Repression usually justifies itself by pointing to fragility. A kingdom is fragile. A church is fragile. A people is fragile. A truth is fragile. Therefore, the argument goes, freedom must be handled only by those strong enough to control it. Everyone else must wait outside the door. Arundel's legacy is a warning about what happens when the protection of truth becomes the policing of thought. Once that shift occurs, The institution may still speak in the language of salvation, but its practical work becomes narrowing, watching, punishing, and preventing. And yet, the impulse he tried to contain did not disappear. Ideas rarely do. They go quiet. They hide in margins, in memory, in small circles of trust. They become dangerous precisely because they are forbidden. A controlled text can acquire a strange power, not because every reader fully understands it, but because authority has revealed how much it fears the act of reading. There is a bitter irony here. By trying to guard sacred meaning from unauthorized voices, men like Arundel helped show how closely knowledge and power were bound together. They made the English Bible not just a religious object, but a political one. They helped prepare the conditions in which later generations would see translation, preaching, and private reading as matters of liberty. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without conflict and persecution on many sides. But the seed was there. Thomas Arundel's place among these cursed names does not depend on imagining him as a simple villain. He is more disturbing if we imagine him as something else. A disciplined guardian of order, a man convinced that the world would be safer if dangerous words passed only through approved mouths. That kind of figure does not belong only to the Middle Ages. Every century produces people who fear what might happen if ordinary minds are trusted too far, and every century has to decide whether protection is becoming a prison. Richard Rich belongs to a different kind of darkness, not the darkness of a battlefield, or a prison cell alone, or a law written to frighten belief into silence. His is the darkness of a room where everyone is listening carefully, because one wrong sentence may outlive the person who speaks it. Tudor England was built for such rooms. It was a world of oaths, examinations, commissions, private interrogations, public trials, and men who understood that conscience was admirable only until it collided with policy. The crown did not merely demand obedience of the body. Increasingly, it demanded signs of inward agreement. What did you believe about the king's supremacy? About the church? About the succession? About the dangerous old loyalties that might still be hiding beneath careful words? In such a world, silence itself could become suspicious. Richard Rich did not create Tudor politics. That would give him too much credit. He rose within a system already skilled at rewarding flexibility and punishing hesitation. But he came to represent one of its most chilling talents, the ability to stand near another person's downfall, provide the necessary testimony, and then continue upward as if history were merely a staircase. He was a lawyer, an administrator, a man of offices and opportunity. Not the loudest figure of his century, not the most ideologically original, not a grand architect of reformation or counter-reformation. His power was subtler than that, and perhaps for that reason more unpleasant. He knew how to be useful. The most infamous moment attached to Rich is the trial of Thomas More. More, the former Lord Chancellor, had refused to endorse the royal supremacy in the way Henry VIII demanded. He was too intelligent to be careless, too legally trained to give his enemies an easy sentence to hang him with. His silence was not empty. It was a strategy, and a deeply principled one. In effect, More tried to survive by refusing to speak what he did not believe, while also refusing to say enough to be convicted of treason. That is a very narrow bridge. Rich helped break it. According to the case against More, Rich reported that More had spoken treasonous words during a private conversation in the Tower. More denied the accusation and attacked Rich's credibility. The evidence is disputed in the sense that we cannot replay the room or recover the exact exchange with perfect certainty. What we have is a deadly collision of testimony, political pressure, and a regime determined to have submission. But Rich's role became notorious because the testimony was so convenient. A silent man could not be executed merely for thoughts no one had heard. The state needed words. Rich supplied them. This is where his reputation hardens into something colder than ambition. Plenty of Tudor officials were ambitious. The whole system ran, in part, on advancement. Men sought favor, office, security, and the king's notice. But Rich came to symbolize the particular ambition that feeds on another person's vulnerability. The question is not only whether he lied. Some have believed he did. Others would phrase the matter more cautiously. The deeper issue is that he occupied the role history distrusts instinctively, the witness whose words fit the needs of power too perfectly. A state that wants a conviction can be very grateful to such a man. Rich's name appears again in connection with Anne Askew, the Protestant gentlewoman and writer who was examined for her beliefs during the last years of Henry VIII. Askew's case belongs to the dangerous religious reversals of the Tudor age, when the ground beneath doctrine kept shifting, and survival depended on knowing not only what was true, but what was currently safe to say. She was accused of heresy, questioned about her religious views, and tortured in an attempt to extract names and connections. Later accounts associate Rich with her suffering, though the degree and nature of his direct involvement should be handled carefully. The outline of the case is grim enough without pretending certainty where the record is complicated. What matters is that Rich's reputation again places him close to coercive power at the moment it presses on a vulnerable body. Anne Askew was not a great magnate defended by armies. She was a woman under interrogation, in a world where theology had become a matter of state danger. Her refusal to give what her examiners wanted made her extraordinary. It also made her exposed. In the machinery of Tudor rule, courage did not protect a person from pain. Sometimes it made pain more likely. And Rich, whether as direct participant, official presence, or symbol of the regime's appetite for confession, becomes part of that machinery. He survived Henry VIII. That alone required skill. But he did more than survive one reign. He adjusted through religious change, moving with the demands of power as England lurched from one settlement to another. Under different rulers and different religious winds, he continued to hold office and influence. The man's convictions, if he had deep ones, do not stand out as clearly as his durability. Durability can be admirable. In Rich, it feels incriminating, because Tudor England was full of people trying to survive. That should be remembered. It is easy, from a safe distance, to demand martyrdom of the dead. Most people did not want to become examples. They wanted to keep their families, their property, their heads, and perhaps enough private conscience to sleep at night. The age did not offer many clean choices, but Rich did not merely keep his head down. He rose. That distinction changes the moral texture of his story. There is a difference between bending because the storm might kill you and learning how to sell shelter during the storm. Rich's career suggests not reluctant compromise, but active adaptation, a gift for discovering what the new order required and providing it before someone else did. In another age, he might have been called pragmatic. In Tudor England, pragmatism could become lethal. The court around Henry VIII was not simply a nest of villains, though it produced its share of them. It was a place where policy, theology, marriage, dynasty, and personal fear fused into one dangerous substance. A man who served the crown might one year be enforcing a religious direction that would, under another monarch, make him suspect. Yesterday's loyalty could become tomorrow's evidence. The safest men were those who could revise themselves quickly. Rich did that very well. Too well, perhaps. His life exposes a quieter terror than open cruelty. It is the terror of the adaptable official, the person for whom no principle seems heavy enough to slow advancement. Such a person does not need to hate the victims. Hatred may even be inefficient. He only needs to understand that someone else's ruin can clear space, settle a question, satisfy a ruler, or prove usefulness. The paperwork moves, the witness speaks, the prisoner is condemned, the official is promoted. No thunder is required. This is why Rich lingers in historical memory with a particular unpleasantness. He represents betrayal without passion, betrayal as career management, betrayal in a controlled voice. And in some ways, he is harder to place than the obvious tyrant. The tyrant commands attention. Rich stands slightly to the side, near the documents, near the examination, near the moment where law turns into a blade. His power lies in making himself necessary to men greater than himself. That is the pattern we have already seen in different forms. Eadric survived by shifting with conquest. Despenser used nearness to a king as a weapon. Arundel guarded authority by narrowing speech. Rich combines pieces of all three, but in the distinctive climate of the Tudors, where the battle for power often passed through conscience itself. To condemn him is not to claim that every accusation against him is equally certain. The historian must keep a steady hand. The testimony against More, the associations with Askew, the shape of his religious flexibility, these are not all the same kind of evidence. Some are firmer than others. Some have been sharpened by later moral memory, especially by admiration for those he helped condemn or pressure. But moral memory is not always wrong because it is passionate. Sometimes the people remembered with disgust earned that disgust not by one act alone, but by the pattern their lives revealed. Rich's pattern is difficult to admire. He appears again and again as the man aligned with the winning side, especially when the winning side needed someone else to suffer. That is a talent history should never romanticize. Every age produces its Richard Riches, not always with titles, not always in courts. They appear wherever institutions reward the person who can translate fear into procedure. They do not have to be fanatics. They may even distrust fanatics. Their loyalty is to position, and position teaches them what to say. In Tudor England, where a sentence could become treason and a private remark could become evidence, such men were not incidental. They were the hinges on which cruelty swung. Richard Rich did not need to be the most powerful man in the room. He only needed to be believed by the most powerful man in the room. The story of Titus Oates begins in a country already prepared to believe the worst. That is important. A lie by itself is not always powerful. Many lies die quickly because the world is not ready for them. They sound wrong. They arrive too early or too late, or in the wrong voice. Oates's lie found England waiting. In 1678, the kingdom was restless with religious suspicion. The memory of civil war had not faded into harmless antiquity. The monarchy had been restored, but restoration did not mean peace of mind. Protestant England looked at Catholic Europe with fear, and at its own Catholic minority with a suspicion that could turn ordinary neighbors into imagined agents of foreign power. France was Catholic and powerful. The Pope, in Protestant imagination, was not merely a religious figure, but a shadowy architect of subversion. Rumor did not need much food to grow. Then Titus Oates stepped forward. He was not an impressive man in the way demagogues sometimes are. He was not elegant like Mosley, not royal like John, not wrapped in high office like Arundel. His past was troubled, his reputation unstable, his character hardly the kind one would choose as the foundation for national trust. And yet for a time England listened. Oates claimed to have discovered a vast Catholic conspiracy to murder King Charles II and place his Catholic brother James, Duke of York, closer to power. The alleged plot was dramatic, sprawling, and convenient. It gave form to fears that were already moving beneath the surface of political life. It turned anxiety into a script. That is why the popish plot became so dangerous. It did not ask people to believe something entirely new. It invited them to believe that their darkest suspicion had finally been confirmed. Oates understood, or at least stumbled into, one of the oldest truths about public panic. People often treat accusation as evidence when the accusation flatters their fear. A claim that would sound absurd in calm weather can feel obvious during a storm. The more terrifying the story, the more some listeners feel it must be important. The lack of proof becomes, in a strange reversal, proof of how well the enemy has hidden itself. Once that logic takes hold, innocence becomes almost impossible to demonstrate. Catholics were accused. Houses were searched. Informers were rewarded. Trials followed. Men were condemned and executed on testimony that later collapsed under scrutiny. The legal system, which should have slowed the fever, became one of the channels through which it spread. Courts can be frightening places when the public arrives already hungry for guilt. Oates did not act in a vacuum. That would be too simple and too generous to the society around him. He was enabled by politicians, clergy, pamphleteers, magistrates, and crowds who found the plot useful or believable. Some sincerely feared Catholic conspiracy. Others saw political opportunity in stirring anti-Catholic feeling, especially in the struggle over the succession and the possibility of a Catholic king. This is where the story becomes larger than one liar. The popish plot was a fiction, but the conditions that made it powerful were real. England's religious divisions were real. Its fear of Catholic absolutism was real. Its memory of violence was real. Its political uncertainty was real. Oates did not create those fractures. He poured poison into them and then presented himself as the physician. There is a particular ugliness in false witness because it steals the moral force of truth. A truthful witness can be one of the most important figures in a society. Someone sees wrongdoing and speaks, often at personal risk. Law depends on such courage. Communities depend on it. Without testimony, many crimes remain hidden. Oates corrupted that role. He dressed invention in the clothing of warning. He learned the language of revelation. Secret meetings, hidden agents, assassination plans, names passed from mouth to mouth. He did what successful conspiracy mongers often do. He gave people enough detail to make fantasy feel organized, and enough vagueness to let fear fill in the gaps. The result was not merely confusion, it was death. Innocent people were swept into the machinery of accusation. Catholic priests and laymen faced a public mood already turned against them. The truth of individual lives mattered less than the usefulness of the larger story. Once a person became a character in the plot, everything about him could be interpreted backward. A friendship became a network. A letter became a code. A denial became cunning. That is how paranoia edits reality. It does not only invent, it rearranges. A harmless act is moved into a sinister frame. A coincidence becomes a clue. A disliked minority becomes a hidden army. And the accuser, instead of being questioned, is praised for seeing what others were too blind or too compromised to admit. For a time, Titus Oates was rewarded. He received attention, protection, and money. He became, in the eyes of many, the man who had saved Protestant England from secret ruin. There is something almost unbearable about that phase of the story. The liar not merely escaping punishment, but being celebrated by the frightened. But public fever is unstable. It can burn hot, and then, slowly or suddenly, consume its own credibility. As the panic stretched on, contradictions became harder to ignore. The claims grew strained. The machinery of belief began to grind against the facts. Eventually, Oates's testimony was exposed as false, and after the political climate shifted, he was tried, convicted of perjury, and brutally punished. The punishment itself belongs to a harsher legal world than ours, and we do not need to admire it in order to understand why his disgrace felt necessary to many. Yet disgrace did not resurrect the dead. That is the permanent imbalance of false accusation. A lie can be corrected in the record, but not always in the lives it destroyed. A reputation may be restored, partially, after years of ruin. A body cannot be unexecuted. A community cannot simply forget the period when suspicion made it unsafe to exist openly. The damage Oates caused was therefore not limited to the people condemned through his testimony. He intensified a culture of religious hatred. He helped make anti-Catholic fear feel like civic duty. He showed politicians how useful panic could be, and he demonstrated that the public, when frightened enough, may accept a deeply flawed messenger if the message confirms what it already wants to believe. That may be the most uncomfortable part. Oates was not believed because he was trustworthy. He was believed because distrust had already become a national habit. This separates him from Richard Rich in an interesting way. Rich operated within rooms of power where testimony could serve the needs of a regime. Oates operated in the open air of public fear, where testimony became spectacle. Rich's danger was cold, procedural, almost bureaucratic. Oates's was feverish. He did not only help the state condemn enemies, he helped the crowd imagine enemies everywhere. And once a crowd learns to enjoy suspicion, truth has a harder road back. The popish plot also warns us against the lazy assumption that panic is always irrational in a simple sense. People caught in it may believe they are being vigilant. They may feel brave for refusing to be deceived. They may think skepticism toward the accused is wisdom, while skepticism toward the accuser is betrayal. That is how fear protects itself. It turns doubt into disloyalty. In the end, Titus Oates was exposed, punished, and remembered with contempt. But his deeper legacy is not that one dishonest man fooled a nation. That is too small a lesson, and it lets everyone else off too easily. The larger lesson is that a society can become so accustomed to imagining an enemy that when a liar finally gives that enemy a name, the lie feels like relief. At last, people think the hidden thing has been revealed. At last, our fear has a witness. And so the doors of law open, the pamphlets multiply, the crowds gather, and the innocent discover that truth alone may not be loud enough to save them. Titus Oates did not nearly throw England into chaos because he was brilliant. He did it because England had already made room for his lie. Culloden is often remembered as a battle, but in Scottish memory it became something larger than a battlefield. It became an ending. In April 1746, on a bleak stretch of moorland near Inverness, the Jacobite rising was broken. The army of Charles Edward Stuart, the figure romantic memory would later soften into Bonnie Prince Charlie, faced the forces of the British government under Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. The fighting itself was brief. The consequences were not. Cumberland was a king's son, a professional soldier, and in the eyes of government supporters, the man who had saved Britain from rebellion. To those who feared a Stuart restoration, he had done what needed to be done. The Jacobite rising was not a harmless pageant of tartan and lost songs. It was a real military and political threat, tied to dynastic conflict, religious anxiety, and European power struggles. Had it succeeded, Britain might have been pulled into a very different future. That is the first complication. The second is Cumberland's nickname, Butcher. Names like that do not emerge from calm disagreement. They are made when victory seems to go beyond necessity, when the defeated feel not simply beaten, but punished as a people. Cumberland's reputation rests not only on Culloden itself, but on what followed. The pursuit of fugitives, accusations of killing the wounded, harsh reprisals, military occupation, and a program of suppression aimed at breaking the social world that had helped sustain Jacobite resistance. Here, we have to move carefully. The history after Culloden has often been told through grief, anger, romanticism, nationalism, and political argument. Some descriptions of Cumberland turn him into a monster without context. Some defenses of him reduce the suffering of the Highlands to the ordinary tidying up after rebellion. Neither approach is good enough. What we can say is that the government response was severe, deliberate, and remembered as brutal. In the aftermath, Jacobite supporters were hunted. Estates could be forfeited. Weapons were seized. Highland dress and symbols associated with clan identity came under attack through law. The authority of clan chiefs was weakened. The aim was not merely to defeat an army that had already lost. It was to dismantle the structures that might allow such a rising to happen again. That distinction matters. War destroys bodies. Repression tries to destroy possibilities. Cumberland's supporters might have argued that this was necessary. The Jacobite risings had repeatedly threatened the state. The Highlands, from the government's perspective, were not a picturesque museum of ancient loyalties. They were a region where armed networks, local chiefs, and Stuart sympathies could become military danger. A state that had nearly watched rebellion reach deep into England was not likely to respond with mild embarrassment and a polite warning. But necessity is one of history's most abused words. It can explain harshness. It can also excuse cruelty before anyone has bothered to measure it. For many Highland communities, the suppression after Culloden was not experienced as an abstract policy. It reached into clothing, weapons, landholding, kinship, movement, and the relationship between people and the chiefs who had once embodied local power. Even where later romantic memory has simplified the old clan world, the disruption was real. A culture was not erased in a single stroke, but it was pressured, regulated, and reshaped by force. This is why Cumberland's memory remains so bitter. He stands at the point where military victory becomes social punishment. The word genocide is sometimes used in popular discussions of the post-Culloden repression. That term should be handled with caution. Historians debate how best to describe what happened, and using modern categories too quickly can flatten the 18th century context. The government did not pursue a simple policy of exterminating all Highland Scots. The story is more specific, and in some ways more chilling because of that specificity. It aimed to break a political culture. It targeted the military, social, and symbolic systems that had made rebellion possible. It punished supporters of a defeated cause and sought to absorb the Highlands more firmly into the authority of the British state. That may not be the same as genocide in the strictest sense, but it was certainly not a gentle reconciliation. The human cost was borne unevenly. As usual, the famous names survived best in memory. Princes, dukes, chiefs, generals. Their portraits hang more easily than the faces of ordinary people who fled across rough ground, hid in the hills, lost kin, lost cattle, lost leases, lost the fragile sense that the world they understood would continue. The defeated poor rarely get to write the first draft of history. Often they become scenery in someone else's tragedy. Culloden, in later imagination, became wrapped in romance. The lost prince, the doomed clans, the last charge, the songs of exile. Romance can preserve grief, but it can also make grief too beautiful. It can turn policy into mist. It can make suffering picturesque enough to be admired from a safe distance. Cumberland cuts through that haze because he is not romantic. He is administrative violence in a red coat. He is the state arriving after the battle with lists, patrols, orders, punishments, and the grim confidence of men who believe rebellion must be taught a lesson memorable enough to outlive the rebels. And yet, if we are honest, Cumberland is not frightening because he was uniquely inhuman. He is frightening because he was a recognizable servant of state power at its most unforgiving. He had a task: defeat rebellion, restore order, prevent recurrence. In another telling, that could be the language of stability. In the Highland memory, it became the language of devastation. The difference between those two tellings is where moral history begins. A government often describes its violence as order. The defeated describe it as terror. The historian's burden is not to accept either voice untested, but to notice what each voice is trying to hide. Government records may hide pain behind necessity. Later memory may hide complexity behind martyrdom. Between them are the dead, the displaced, the punished, and the people forced to live under the settlement that victory imposed. Cumberland's place among Britain's cursed names comes from this unresolved tension. He was the victor of Culloden, but victory did not cleanse the manner of its use. He helped secure the Hanoverian state, but the securing of states can leave wounds that official histories struggle to name. He became a hero in some parts of Britain and a byword for cruelty in others. That split reputation tells us that nations do not remember as one body. They remember through regions, families, losses, loyalties, and inherited anger. To some, Cumberland was the man who ended a dangerous rebellion. To others, he was the butcher who taught the Highlands what defeat would cost. Both memories come from real historical forces. Only one carries the wound. What makes his story important here is not simply that he was accused of brutality. Many commanders have been. It is that Cumberland reveals how easily victory can become moral permission. Once the enemy is labeled rebel, traitor, savage, backward, or disloyal, almost anything done afterward can be presented as cleaning up the problem. The defeated are no longer opponents. They become an infection in the body politic. We heard something similar in the world of religious repression. Error imagined as disease. Here the language changes, but the motion is familiar. Disorder must be cut out. A culture must be disciplined. A people must be remade for their own good, or for the safety of everyone else. That is the cold logic behind many state punishments. Culloden's field is quiet now, but quiet landscapes can be deceptive. They invite the visitor to think the event is finished because the grass has grown over it. Yet the memory of Cumberland did not stay on the moor. It moved into songs, stories, family histories, political arguments, and the long debate over what Britain did to become Britain. The Duke of Cumberland did not merely win a battle. He helped turn defeat into a policy. And that is why his name endured in bitterness. Because at Culloden, the sword did not go back into its sheath when the fighting ended. It became, for a time, the instrument by which a whole way of life was made to understand that the future would belong to someone else. The name Jack the Ripper is one of the most famous names in criminal history, which is strange, because it may not have been the killer's name at all. It was a signature, a label, a performance attached to letters whose authorship remains uncertain. And over time, the label became larger than the women whose deaths created it. That is the first thing to resist. The story of Whitechapel in 1888 is often told as if it belongs to the murderer. His mystery, his movements, his identity, his cleverness, his escape. The city becomes his stage. The victims become clues. Their lives are reduced to the final moments that made them useful to someone else's legend. That is not investigation. That is surrendering to the myth. The more honest place to begin is not with the faceless man, but with the streets that made poor women vulnerable long before he appeared. Whitechapel was not merely a backdrop of fog and gaslight. no matter how often later imagination has dressed it that way. It was a crowded district in London's East End, marked by poverty, insecure lodging, irregular work, immigration, noise, hunger, charity, suspicion, and survival, conducted one night at a time. The people who lived there were not decorative shadows in a Victorian nightmare. They were workers, mothers, neighbors, drinkers, migrants, believers, skeptics, debtors, and people doing whatever the city allowed them to do. For poor women, especially those without stable housing or reliable protection, danger was not unusual. It was structural. The victims most commonly associated with the Ripper murders, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were not simply fallen women. The phrase Victorian respectability liked to use when it wanted pity and judgment in the same breath. They had histories. They had relationships. They had known work, loss, illness, alcohol, grief, and the exhausting mathematics of poverty. A bed for the night could be the difference between shelter and exposure. A few coins mattered. Respectability was easier to preach when one had a locked door. This is where the Ripper story becomes more than a murder mystery. It becomes an indictment of the city that noticed these women most intensely only after they were dead. The killings produced fear because they seemed intimate, random, and impossible to control. Women in Whitechapel were already navigating a hard world, but the murders changed the emotional weather. Ordinary streets became charged with threat. Men were watched. Strangers were suspected. Rumors moved faster than facts. Police were pressured. Newspapers fed the public appetite. And the unknown killer became a figure onto whom London projected anxieties it did not know how to solve. Urban modernity had promised light, speed, crowds, industry, newspapers, railways, and the sense that the great city understood itself. Whitechapel exposed the lie. Here was the capital of empire, wealthy beyond comparison, unable to protect women at the edge of its own prosperity. Here was a city with police, press, charities, investigators, and moral reformers, yet the killer was not caught. The gap between imperial confidence and local helplessness is one reason the case endured. It embarrassed the story Britain liked to tell about itself, and then the newspapers made the unknown man famous. Not alone, of course. Public fascination already existed. Fear sells because fear feels like knowledge when it is fresh. The press did not invent the murders, but it shaped the way they were consumed. Reports, rumors, letters, theories, sketches, and speculation turned violence into serial drama. The killer became a presence in print before he was ever identified in law. This is the origin of the name's power. Jack the Ripper sounds almost fictional because, in part, it is a construction of media and panic. The actual person, whoever he was, remains unconfirmed. The name gave the public something to hold. It made the invisible feel like a character. It made terror marketable. That is a dangerous transformation. Once a murderer becomes a character, attention begins to bend toward him. People ask what he wanted, where he went, how he escaped, whether he taunted the police, whether he was a doctor, a butcher, a foreigner, an aristocrat, a lunatic, a genius. The questions multiply, and some are reasonable in a criminal investigation. But beyond a certain point, curiosity becomes worship wearing a detective's coat. The victims disappear again. This is why the Ripper belongs uneasily on a list of Britain's worst figures. Unlike the others, he has no confirmed identity, no known office, no political doctrine, no trial record that allows history to say with certainty, "Here is the man." The cursed name is not a person in the ordinary historical sense. It is an absence, a mask with nothing proven behind it. And that absence has become profitable for more than a century. Suspects have been named and renamed. Theories have risen, collapsed, and returned with new packaging. Some are careful. Many are not. The lack of certainty creates a marketplace where almost any confident claim can briefly shine. The mystery survives partly because the evidence is incomplete, partly because the crimes were genuinely difficult to solve, and partly because an unnamed killer invites endless projection. Every generation builds the ripper it needs, a monster of the slums, a hidden gentleman, a medical man, a foreign threat, a symbol of misogyny, a media creation, a police failure, a puzzle to be solved on a bookshelf. But the women remain less mysterious than the man, and for that reason they are too often treated as less interesting. That is backwards. Their lives tell us more about Victorian Britain than the unknown killer ever can. They reveal the fragility of working-class survival, the moral cruelty directed at poor women, the failures of housing, labor, policing, and public sympathy. They show a society that had elaborate language for sin, but far less interest in the conditions that made survival precarious. The murders were personal acts of violence. The vulnerability was social. That distinction matters because it keeps us from letting the killer carry all the darkness by himself. A murderer acted, but he acted in a landscape where certain lives were already undervalued, where poverty pushed women into danger, and where the dead could be turned almost immediately into symbols, warnings, scandals, or entertainment. The police investigation, under enormous pressure, struggled with limited forensic tools by modern standards, chaotic information, and the difficulty of policing a densely populated district where many people lived publicly because they had no private space. The modern viewer may look back and see missed chances everywhere. Some criticism is fair, but hindsight can become arrogant if it forgets the limits of the time. What is harder to excuse is the hunger that grew around the case, the hunger for the killer to be clever, the hunger for the murders to form a perfect pattern, the hunger for the final reveal. That hunger has kept the name alive, but it has not always honored the dead. To tell the story responsibly is to make peace with frustration. We do not know with certainty who Jack the Ripper was. We may never know. The evidence has been handled, lost, interpreted, mythologized, and fought over for too long. Some claims are stronger than others, but none has closed the case beyond serious dispute. So the honest documentary does not end this part with a suspect pulled from the dark. It ends with the dark itself examined. Why did this unknown killer become more famous than many named tyrants? Why did his lack of a face make him larger rather than smaller? Why did the murders of poor women become a legend people revisit for entertainment, while the conditions of their lives receive only passing attention? Those questions are less tidy than a solution. They are also more revealing. Jack the Ripper's place in this gallery is not only about murder, it is about the making of criminal celebrity. It is about a society and a media culture that turned women's suffering into an enduring brand of fear. It is about the way an absence can dominate memory when the victims have not been given enough room to be fully human. The name without a face should not be allowed to own the story. If there is any justice left in remembering Whitechapel, it begins by taking the spotlight away from the mask and returning it, however imperfectly, to the women who had names before the world gave one to their killer. Oswald Mosley does not arrive from the medieval world of oaths and castles, or the confessional violence of the Tudors, or the gaslit terror of Whitechapel. He arrives in good tailoring. That is part of the danger. Modern extremism does not always begin with a mob looking like a mob. Sometimes it begins with a polished speaker in a hall, a newspaper column, a uniform designed to impress, a promise that everything broken can be made orderly again if only the right people are blamed. Mosley was not an outsider shouting from the margins of British life. He came from privilege. He had social confidence, political access, and the kind of personal presence that made people listen before they had fully examined what he was saying. He had served in Parliament. He had moved through established politics before turning toward fascism. That journey matters because it reminds us that dangerous ideas do not always enter a country through the back door. Sometimes they walk through respectable rooms first. His movement, the British Union of Fascists, borrowed from the authoritarian politics rising elsewhere in Europe. It offered discipline, spectacle, national revival, and the emotional satisfaction of enemies clearly named. It used rallies, uniforms, organization, slogans, marches, and confrontation. It wanted politics to feel physical, not merely argued, but displayed. This is one of fascism's old tricks. It turns uncertainty into theater. A society in economic distress, bruised by war, worried about decline, suspicious of outsiders, and impatient with ordinary politics can become vulnerable to the person who offers not a policy, but a performance of strength. Mosley understood the appeal of that performance. He could sound modern, energetic, decisive. He presented himself as the man willing to cut through weakness, compromise, and delay. But beneath the style was poison. Mosley's movement became associated with anti-Semitism, anti-immigration rhetoric, street violence, and the intimidation of opponents. The hatred was not incidental decoration. It was part of the political engine. Fascism needs a story of national purity injured by internal enemies. It needs scapegoats who can be blamed for complexity. It needs a public trained to mistake cruelty for courage. In Britain, that hatred focused especially on Jews, including communities in London's East End. There is a grim historical echo here. Whitechapel and the East End had already been turned, in Victorian imagination, into a landscape of fear, poverty, and suspicion. Decades later, fascist politics marched toward some of the same streets, not hunting an unknown murderer, but manufacturing a known enemy. The poor, the immigrant, the Jewish resident, the person marked as alien. Once again, lives at the edge of respectability became available for public menace. Mosley's danger was not that he conquered Britain. He did not. That fact can make him seem, at first glance, less catastrophic than figures who held greater power or caused immediate deaths on a larger scale. He failed to take control of the state. British fascism never became the ruling force he imagined. He was eventually detained during the Second World War, when the government saw him as a threat in a country fighting fascist powers abroad. But failure is not innocence. A failed extremist can still widen the range of acceptable hatred. He can teach people new gestures of contempt. He can organize resentment. He can give the lonely bigot a crowd, the violent man a uniform, the frightened citizen a target, and the ambitious follower a sense of mission. He can make old prejudices feel young and disciplined. Mosley's true legacy lies there, not in what he achieved at the summit of power, but in what he helped legitimize below it. The Battle of Cable Street in 1936 remains one of the defining moments in the memory of British fascism. Mosley's followers planned to march through an area with a large Jewish population. Anti-fascist demonstrators, local residents, Jews, Irish dockers, socialists, communists, trade unionists, and others resisted. The streets became a contested space, not simply between two political groups, but between two visions of public life. Who had the right to feel safe in the city? Who had the right to march as a threat? Who would the law protect? Cable Street has often been remembered through the slogan of resistance, through the physical barricades, through the sense that ordinary people stood where institutions seemed uncertain. Like all remembered events, it can be simplified. The politics of the crowd were varied. The policing was controversial. Later memory has polished some edges and sharpened others. Still, the central meaning is not hard to grasp. Mosley's fascism was not merely an opinion sitting harmlessly in a pamphlet. It sought space. It wanted streets. It wanted bodies moving together in intimidating formation. It wanted minorities to understand that the nation could be performed against them. That is why public resistance mattered. Fascist politics feeds on momentum and appearance. It needs to look inevitable. It needs the individual to feel small before the disciplined mass. When that image is broken, when the street refuses the choreography, the spell weakens. Cable Street did not end anti-Semitism in Britain, and it did not erase Mosley's movement overnight. History is not that generous, but it showed that intimidation could be met. Mosley also understood media, or at least the politics of attention. He knew that spectacle travels. A calm speech may persuade a few. A clash in the street can make a movement seem larger than it is. Extremists often benefit from outrage because outrage proves they matter. This creates a difficult problem for any society. Ignore them, and they may organize unchecked. Confront them, and they may feed on the confrontation. There is no easy answer, but there is a clear warning. Democracy is not only threatened when tanks enter the capital, it is threatened earlier, when people grow bored with restraint, when humiliation becomes a political resource, when minorities are described as contamination, when violence is excused as patriotic impatience, when the public begins to admire men who seem untroubled by cruelty. Mosley dressed that temptation in the language of national renewal. That phrase, national renewal, is one of the most dangerous in politics when it refuses to say who must be excluded to achieve it. Renewal can mean reform, repair, shared sacrifice, democratic rebuilding. Or it can mean purification. Fascist movements prefer the second meaning while pretending to offer the first. They promise a cleaner future. Then they begin naming the dirt. Mosley's charisma made this more dangerous, not less. We like to imagine hateful politics as obviously ugly, delivered by people no reasonable person would trust. That is a comforting fiction. Hatred often survives because it can be made elegant. It can borrow the manners of the upper class, the rhythm of military order, the vocabulary of efficiency, the aesthetics of youth, the romance of action. The black shirt was not only clothing, it was a message. We are disciplined. We are modern. We are not asking permission. For those already frightened by social change, this could feel intoxicating. For those targeted by it, the message was plain enough. The performance of strength was built on the promise of someone else's fear. Mosley's personal story, after the height of British fascism, did not redeem the damage. Like many extremists who fail, he lived long enough for the world around him to change, and for his own past to be argued over, minimized, repackaged, or defended by those drawn to the old poison in new bottles. That, too, is part of the problem with fascist memory. It rarely disappears entirely. It waits for disappointment, then offers a familiar script with updated scenery. This is why he belongs in a gallery of corrupted power, even without a crown, a medieval office, or a confirmed body count comparable to others in the list. He represents the politics of permission. The permission to hate openly. The permission to treat neighbors as invaders. The permission to use public space as a threat. The permission to imagine democracy as weakness and violence as honesty. Compared with Titus Oates, Mosley's lie was less a single false plot than a whole political mythology. Oates told England there was a hidden enemy conspiring in the dark. Mosley told Britain that national decline had enemies who could be named in daylight. Both depended on fear already present in the culture. Both gave fear a direction. Both showed how accusation can become a form of power. But Mosley's danger feels especially modern because it speaks in systems: party organization, public relations, street mobilization, ideological branding, the careful conversion of resentment into movement. He did not need to win an election to leave damage behind. Every person frightened out of a street, every Jewish family hearing boots and slogans approach, every follower taught that violence could be noble if aimed at the right target. These were not theoretical harms. They were the lived consequences of a politics that wanted to make cruelty respectable. The lesson of Mosley is not that Britain was uniquely vulnerable to fascism, nor that it was immune. The lesson is more honest than either myth. Britain contained both the attraction and the resistance. It produced the elegant fascist and the crowd that blocked him. The polished demagogue and the ordinary people who understood, perhaps more quickly than some officials, what his movement meant when it came marching toward their homes. That is where the story should leave him. Not as a failed curiosity from the 1930s, not as a darkly stylish footnote, but as a warning about the social life of hatred. Hatred does not become powerful only when it captures the state. It becomes powerful when enough people decide it deserves a platform, a uniform, a march, a cheer, a respectable excuse. Oswald Mosley's greatest danger was not that he made fascism victorious in Britain. It was that he tried to make it feel British. Taken together, these 10 names do not form a single kind of evil. That is the first thing the gallery teaches. If history were only a contest between good people and bad people, it would be easier to narrate and far easier to survive. But the figures we have followed do not resemble one another neatly. Some were powerful by birth. Some climbed. Some served the throne. Some stood beside it. Some weaponized belief. One weaponized a lie. One became famous because his identity was never found at all. Their damage moved through different channels. Eadric Streona shows the danger of betrayal when a society is already close to breaking. He did not need to command an invading army. He only needed to shift, calculate, and make loyalty feel conditional at the very moment England needed steadiness. His story is not simply about treason. It is about what happens when survival becomes the only principle left. Thomas Becket is harder, because his case is not built from simple appetite. He stands for the danger of sacred conflict when office, conscience, pride, and institutional power become impossible to separate. To some, he was the murdered defender of the church. To others, he was a man whose refusal to bend helped turn a legal and political argument into a crisis with blood at its center. Becket reminds us that even principle can become dangerous when it is fused to personal destiny. King John gives us tyranny in a more recognizable form: suspicion, extraction, humiliation, and the steady destruction of trust. His reign shows that bad government is not always chaotic from the beginning. Sometimes it is energetic, intelligent, and very attentive to revenue. John knew how to use the levers of rule. His tragedy, and England's warning, was that he pulled them without enough wisdom to notice the structure cracking around him. Hugh Despenser the Younger reveals something more intimate: the corruption of access. He was not the king. That almost makes the story worse. A favorite can act as a private tunnel into public power, turning affection into land, law, pressure, and fear. Despenser's life warns that institutions do not only fail when the ruler is cruel, they also fail when the ruler allows private desire to borrow the authority of the state. Thomas Arundel takes us into another chamber entirely, where the contested territory is not land but thought. His power worked through restriction, permission, doctrine, and fear of unauthorized belief. He represents the moment when protection of truth becomes control over conscience. In his world, a book in the wrong hands could become an emergency. That should sound old, and yet not entirely old. Richard Rich stands for opportunism made professional. Not the wild opportunism of a battlefield defector, but the polished opportunism of the useful witness, the adaptable official, the man who knows which sentence power needs to hear. His career reminds us that every age of repression requires technicians. Someone must record the statement, carry the message, confirm the suspicion, and keep moving upward. Titus Oates shows this power of fear when it finds a voice. His lie succeeded because it entered a society already trained to imagine Catholic conspiracy. That is what makes him so revealing. He was not believed because he was admirable. He was believed because the lie felt familiar before it was proven. Oates is the warning that paranoia does not need truth to become deadly. It only needs an audience that mistakes its own terror for insight. The Duke of Cumberland represents victory that refuses to stop being violent. At Culloden, military defeat became the beginning of a wider punishment. His name endured because the state's response moved beyond battle into repression, memory, culture, and the forced remaking of a defeated region. Cumberland shows how power can call itself order, while others experience it as devastation. Jack the Ripper is different again. He is not a ruler, not a minister, not a preacher, not a politician. He is a name without a confirmed face. And yet his place here exposes another mechanism of harm, the making of terror into legend. His crimes were terrible, but the afterlife of the name reveals a second failure, a culture more fascinated by the unknown killer than by the women whose vulnerability made the murders possible. And Oswald Mosley brings the gallery into the modern age, where hatred learns organization, design, and public relations. His danger was not that he seized Britain, but that he tried to make fascism feel orderly, stylish, and patriotic. He reminds us that political extremism does not always arrive screaming nonsense in the margins. Sometimes it arrives with a platform, a uniform, a microphone, and a promise to restore national dignity by choosing who does not belong. So what binds them? Not personality, not class, not ideology, not even the scale of harm. What binds them is mechanism. Each one found, or became, a weakness in the society around him. Eadric found a kingdom whose loyalties were cracking. John found a monarchy whose power had not yet learned enough limits. Despenser found a king who confused personal attachment with political judgment. Arundel found a church and state frightened by uncontrolled belief. Rich found a court where testimony could become a weapon. Oates found a nation already rehearsing panic. Cumberland found a defeated enemy the state wanted made harmless forever. The Ripper found women exposed by poverty and indifference. Mosley found modern resentment waiting for choreography. This is the more useful way to read the list. Not as a parade of monsters, but as a study in vulnerability. Because the frightening lesson is that none of these men acted in a vacuum. Even the murderer without a confirmed name acted within a city that had already failed many of its poor. Even the liar needed listeners. Even the favorite needed a king. Even the persecutor needed institutions. Even the demagogue needed halls, followers, newspapers, and streets where intimidation could be staged. Corrupted power is rarely solitary. It gathers helpers, excuses, procedures, fears, and silences. That does not absolve the individual. It sharpens the accusation. A person who exploits a weakness in the world is still responsible for what he does with it. But if we stop at the individual, we miss the structure that made him effective. We get the satisfaction of condemnation without the harder work of recognition. And recognition is the point. The traitor does not always announce treason. He may call it realism, The tyrant does not always call himself cruel. He may call himself efficient. The censor may call control protection. The opportunist may call betrayal service. The liar may call panic vigilance. The butcher may call repression order. The extremist may call hatred renewal. The murderer may even disappear completely, leaving the public to do part of his myth-making for him. That is why the list should make us uneasy, not because judgment is impossible, but because judgment is not enough. It is comforting to imagine that history's worst figures belong to strange, distant categories of human nature. The medieval traitor, the bad king, the corrupt favorite, the fanatic archbishop, the Tudor informer, the Restoration liar, the Hanoverian butcher, the Victorian killer, the fascist aristocrat. Place them in costumes and they seem safely contained. Take the costumes away, and the mechanisms remain familiar. Fear still seeks a target. Power still dislikes restraint. Institutions still protect themselves. Public anger still rewards simple enemies. Ambitious people still discover that conscience can slow a career. Crowds still enjoy the feeling of being righteously alarmed. Leaders still confuse loyalty to themselves with loyalty to the nation. And victims still risk being remembered last. Perhaps that is the quiet failure hidden inside every list of the worst. A list of perpetrators keeps our eyes on the people who acted, commanded, lied, punished, profited, or killed. That is necessary. Names matter. Responsibility matters. But harm does not end with the person who caused it. It continues outward, into the lives that were interrupted, narrowed, frightened, dispossessed, or erased. The 10 faces are only the visible part. Behind them are the people who had to live inside the consequences, the murdered rival, the accused heretic, the widow pressured over land, the prisoner whose private words became evidence, the Catholic dragged into a plot that never existed, the Highland family, whose world was disciplined after defeat. The women of Whitechapel, made famous in death, but neglected in life. The Jewish residents of the East End, watching fascism march toward their streets. The gallery changes when they enter it. It stops being a ranking of cursed names. It becomes a record of how power wounds downward. A list of the worst people in history always begins with a strange kind of confidence. It asks us to look at the past and point. There. That one. But the longer we stay with these stories, the less satisfying the pointing becomes. Not because the men we have followed deserve sympathy in some careless way. Some caused real harm. Some exploited fear. Some profited from weakness. Some helped turn law, faith, rumor, or public force against people with less power than themselves. The problem is not that judgment is too harsh. The problem is that judgment is too narrow. Because behind every infamous name is a much larger crowd of the less remembered, the people whose lives became the cost. Start again with Eadric Streona, and the story is not only about one traitor moving between rulers, it is about a kingdom full of people who had to survive the consequences of elite betrayal. Anglo-Saxon England did not fall as an idea in a manuscript. It fell in estates, villages, loyalties, inheritances, hostages, negotiations, and men dragged into wars decided by those above them. When powerful nobles shifted sides, ordinary people did not get to shift so easily. They inherited the danger without sharing the choice. That is how betrayal travels downward. The same is true of King John. His reign is usually told through barons, castles, lost territories, and Magna Carta. Those are important. But royal pressure was not felt only in great halls. Financial extraction, legal manipulation, and political instability passed through the kingdom in practical ways. A fine imposed at the top could mean local demands below, A royal quarrel could become a regional burden. A king's distrust could teach everyone beneath him to be more cautious, more defensive, less certain that law existed for protection rather than leverage. Magna Carta survives as parchment and principle. The suffering that helped produce it was less neatly preserved. With Hugh Despenser, the victims come closer into view, though still often through the records of property and complaint. Widows, heiresses, rivals, families whose lands became desirable because Despenser had the king's favor behind him. It is tempting to think of medieval land disputes as dry legal matter, the sort of thing that belongs to archivists and footnotes. But land was life. Land was food, status, marriage, memory, defense, and the future of children not yet born. To be dispossessed was not merely to lose acreage, it was to be pushed downward in the world. And when a favorite like Despenser used royal access to strengthen private claims, the victims did not experience that as an abstract failure of governance. They experienced it as a door closing, a petition ignored, a judgment tilted, a powerful man's appetite becoming their family's emergency. Thomas Arundel's victims are harder to count because thought leaves fewer bodies in the record than war does. But the damage of repression does not need to be spectacular to be real. Consider the believer who hesitated before speaking, the preacher who measured every phrase, the reader who wondered whether a text in English might endanger him, the neighbor drawn into suspicion, the person whose private religious hunger became a matter for authority. This is a quieter kind of injury. It narrows the inner life. A society of surveillance does not only punish those it catches, it trains everyone else to anticipate being watched. People begin to censor themselves before the censor arrives. They learn which questions are safe, which words attract attention, which silences are prudent. Arundel's legacy belongs there, not only in formal measures against heresy, but in the atmosphere that makes conscience feel licensed rather than free. Then there is Richard Rich, and the victims of Tudor political religion. Thomas More is remembered, canonized by some, debated by others, still present in books and films and arguments about conscience. Anne Askew, too, has not vanished. Her courage left marks in the record, but around them were many others living under the same pressure. Officials asked to enforce policies that might change under the next monarch. Families wondering which belief would be dangerous next year. Prisoners learning that a conversation could become evidence if repeated by the right witness. The terror of Rich's world was not simply that people died. It was that language itself became unsafe. A sentence could be extracted, reshaped, reported, denied, and still used. The private room was not fully private. The law did not always protect the careful. A person could choose silence and discover that silence needed interpretation by enemies. When we call Rich an opportunist, we should remember what opportunity meant in practice. It meant someone else cornered, someone else questioned, someone else made useful to the ambitions of a survivor. Titus Oates left a different field of victims. Men condemned by a lie, Catholic families frightened by public hatred, communities forced to live beneath the suspicion that they were not neighbors but conspirators. The popish plot did not merely damage those who went to trial, it thickened the air around an entire minority. It made ordinary Catholic existence feel politically charged, as if identity itself were evidence waiting to be arranged into accusation. This is one of paranoia's cruelties. It does not need every member of a group to be individually accused. It only needs the group to become imaginable as a threat. After that, each person carries the burden of the fantasy. A priest is not just a priest. A household is not just a household. A ritual is not just a ritual. Everything can be made to point toward the invented plot, because the plot has taught the public how to read. The Duke of Cumberland's victims are remembered through a landscape of defeat. Highland communities after Culloden did not experience repression as a single policy line in a government document. They experienced it through soldiers, searches, forfeitures, restrictions, hunger, fear, and the breaking of older patterns of authority. Again, we should avoid turning the Highland past into pure romance. Clan society had its own hierarchies, violences, and inequalities. The old world was not a song without cruelty, but a complicated culture can still be wounded. The people who bore the punishment after Culloden were not all decision-makers in the rising. Some were attached by kinship, geography, tenancy, obligation, fear, loyalty, or simple circumstance. When the state decided that a political culture had to be broken, it was not only the romantic rebel who paid, it was the household trying to continue after the army had moved on. And then there are the women of Whitechapel. Here, the imbalance of memory becomes almost unbearable. The unknown killer became one of the most famous names in the world. The victims had names first, and yet the world often treats them as supporting characters in his mystery. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their names should interrupt the rhythm of fascination. They lived before they were evidence. They were not clues arranged for later generations to solve. They were women moving through poverty, unstable shelter, failing health, fractured relationships, small acts of endurance, and the daily indignities of being judged by people more comfortable than themselves. Their deaths horrified London, but their lives had not commanded the same urgency. That is perhaps the deepest accusation against Victorian society in this story. Not that it produced one murderer. Every society produces violence, but that it produced conditions in which some women could be exposed to danger night after night, then made famous only when their suffering became sensational. The victim in such a story is twice reduced, first by poverty, then by legend. Mosley's victims were not victims in the same way as those murdered in Whitechapel, or condemned by Oates's falsehoods, and that difference matters. But his movement inflicted fear, intimidation, and public hatred on real communities, especially Jews and immigrants in places where fascist marching was not theoretical. A slogan shouted in a hall may sound like politics to one listener, and like a warning to pack a bag to another. That is what extremists often count on. They know that public menace speaks in two registers. To supporters, it sounds like courage. To targets, it sounds like permission being granted to those who might harm them. The same march can be sold as patriotism and experienced as a threat. The victims left outside the list are not always dead. Some are simply made to live differently. They avoid a street, hide a book, soften an accent, change a name, lower their voice upon, pay what is demanded, accept the insult, watch the crowd, teach their children caution before joy. Historical harm is not measured only in bodies, though bodies matter. It is also measured in the shrinking of possible lives. This is why a perpetrator-centered history, while necessary, is incomplete. It can unintentionally reproduce the structure of power it means to condemn. The powerful man remains at the center. The traitor, the king, the archbishop, the favorite, the informer, the liar, the commander, the killer, the fascist. Each receives his portrait, his motives, his dramatic arc. The people below him become background. But they were never background to themselves. They woke in the morning inside the world these men helped make. They worried about food, safety, rent, belief, reputation, children, kin, trial, soldiers, neighbors, and the next knock at the door. They did not experience history as a list of villains. They experienced it as pressure. Pressure is less memorable than a name, but often more important. It is the pressure that tells us what power actually did. A king's cruelty is not only in his temper, it is in the habits his rule creates around him. A censor's harm is not only in the condemned book, it is in the unwritten thought. A liar's damage is not only in the false testimony, it is in the neighbor who now suspects before knowing. A demagogue's danger is not only in his speech, it is in the child who hears adults decide that hatred is normal. The victims restore scale. They remind us that history's cursed names were not cursed in isolation. They became cursed because their choices entered other people's lives and changed the terms on which those lives could be lived. And perhaps this is where the gallery becomes most honest, not when we stare hardest at the faces on the wall, but when we notice the crowd behind us, the people not painted, the people not quoted, the people whose grief, fear, and endurance made the damage real. So we return to the question that opened the door. Who was the worst? It is tempting, even now, to choose. The mind likes a verdict. It wants the list to narrow, the evidence to gather, the final name to rise above the others like a sentence being pronounced. Was it the traitor who made collapse easier? The king whose failures helped force limits on monarchy? The favorite who turned royal intimacy into a private weapon? The archbishop who helped make belief a matter of surveillance? The official who always seemed to find safety on the winning side? The liar who turned fear into executions? The commander whose victory became repression? The unknown killer made immortal by the very culture that should have mourned his victims first? The fascist who tried to give hatred a British uniform? A case can be made for several of them. But the longer we look, the more the word worst begins to fray. Not because the harm disappears, and not because moral judgment is impossible. It frays because each figure belongs to a different moral weather. Betrayal is not tyranny. Censorship is not murder. False witness is not military repression. Fascist intimidation is not the same as medieval land hunger. The unknown killer of Whitechapel cannot be measured by the same scale as a king, because one acted outside the state and the other as the state's living center. History resists a single measuring instrument, and perhaps that resistance is useful, because the real question is not only which person did the most damage, it is what kind of world allowed the damage to spread. That is where the story becomes less comfortable, because the answer is never just one man. Eadric needed a kingdom under strain, where loyalty could be traded because the future looked uncertain. John needed a monarchy still powerful enough to exploit, but not yet restrained enough to stop him. Despenser needed a king willing to confuse personal devotion with political judgment. Arundel needed institutions frightened by unsupervised thought. Rich needed a regime that made conscience legally dangerous. Oates needed a public already rehearsing religious panic. Cumberland needed a victorious state prepared to treat a defeated culture as a problem to be broken. The Ripper needed a city where poor women were visible enough to be hunted and invisible enough to be neglected. Mosley needed resentment, economic anxiety, anti-Semitism, and people willing to mistake cruelty for strength. None of that absolves them. It makes the warning larger. Cruel individuals matter. They choose, act, speak, accuse, seize, punish, and kill. But individuals become historically dangerous when their private defects find public machinery. A bitter man with no audience may remain merely bitter. A liar with no believers is only noise. A censor without institutions is just a scold. A demagogue without followers is a man shouting at the weather. The danger begins when the world answers back. Yes, it says, we can use you. This is the pattern hidden beneath the portraits. Societies do not usually collapse into harm because everyone wakes one morning intending cruelty. More often, harm advances through smaller permissions. A questionable accusation is tolerated because the target is unpopular. A harsh law is accepted because the authorities call it necessary. A leader's abuse is excused because he promises stability. A minority is blamed because the explanation feels emotionally satisfying. A victim is ignored because her life was already considered inconvenient. The silence of the many rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It feels like prudence. It feels like not getting involved. It feels like waiting for better evidence, even when the evidence is already human suffering. It feels like trusting that someone else will object, that the system will correct itself, that the rumor cannot really go that far, that the march is only a march, that the law is only aimed at dangerous people, that the king must have his reasons. History is full of people who discovered too late what permission they had granted. This is why the list of cursed names should not let us leave feeling superior. It should not make the past look like a foreign country populated by cruder souls. The clothing has changed. The institutions have changed. The language has changed. But the weaknesses are not extinct. Power still seeks fewer limits. Fear still enjoys confirmation. Ambition still studies the room. Crowds still reward the person who names an enemy. Institutions still confuse their survival with the public good. And ordinary people still underestimate the cost of looking away. The worst person, then, may not be a single person at all. That does not mean responsibility dissolves into fog. King John remains responsible for King John. Titus Oates remains responsible for his lies. Mosley remains responsible for the hatred he organized. The unknown murderer of Whitechapel, whoever he was, remains responsible for the women he killed. But history's darker lesson is that evil often becomes effective through cooperation. Not always enthusiastic cooperation, but cooperation nonetheless. The clerk who records, the official who obeys, the neighbor who repeats, the reader who buys the sensational version, the voter who enjoys the insult, the priest, judge, soldier, landlord, editor, courtier, policeman, or respectable citizen who decides that this time the cruelty is useful. That is the world behind the worst. And it is a harder thing to condemn because it looks less like a monster and more like a habit. In the end, these 10 names survive because they give shape to dangers that never fully vanish. Betrayal in a time of fear. Rule without restraint. Access without accountability. Faith without mercy. Ambition without conscience. Suspicion without evidence. Victory without limits. Violence turned into legend. Hatred dressed as national renewal. Each danger has its own face. Each face has its own century. But the lesson they form together is not trapped in the past. A society becomes vulnerable when its institutions are weak, when power is unchecked, when prejudice feels respectable, when media learns to profit from panic, when people prefer a useful lie to a difficult truth, and when silence becomes easier than solidarity. That is why the final answer cannot be only a name. The worst Briton, if such a title can even be honestly given, is less important than the recurring conditions that made these figures possible. The list began as a gallery of the condemned. It ends as a mirror, not because we are the same as them, but because the mechanisms they used are still recognizable. The past does not warn us by being identical. It warns us by being familiar. So perhaps the most honest verdict is this: history's worst figures are not warnings against rare monsters alone. They are warnings against ordinary systems of permission, against the moment. A community decides that one person's suffering is acceptable, one group's fear is useful, one abuse of power is necessary, one lie is close enough to what we already believe. That is where the damage begins. Not always with the sword raised. Not always with the prison door closing. Sometimes it begins earlier, in the quiet decision to let the first wrong thing pass. And by the time the name is cursed, the world that allowed it has often already moved on, looking for someone else to blame,